So going on to coping, let's consider these two statements by famous poets, writers. Shakespeare said, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the overfraught heart and bids it break." Or Daniel, "Grief keep within and scorn to show but tears, disdain to sigh, for so can slender cares grow." Now, in scientific terms, these are incredibly important hypotheses, one could say. The first one is telling us, to share our grief, to disclose it, to talk about it, to feel it. And the other, stiff upper lip, keep it to yourself, otherwise it'll get worse. These are potentially ways of coping, and coping can be influenced. And this is why I think Henk and I considered it most important to focus on coping with grief and grieving in our work. It's something that can be changed. You can't change the dreadful fact that you've lost a loved person. You can potentially change the way you go about dealing with it. You can change your thoughts about it. You can work on your own feelings. And these here are two different ways that one could imagine one could go about coping. Here we see perhaps a pictorial representation of the two statements that I just showed you. On the one hand, we see a rather stiff gentleman and his wife bent over. These are the portraits, the sculptures of Katie Kollwitz. Some of you will know her work, the German sculptress whose son died at the end of the First World War. When he was 19, he was killed. And this sculpture of herself and her husband took her actually 19 years to produce. It's one of the most impactful sculptures. I will come back to her work later. All right, so going from the poetic to the pictorial to the scientific, how do we go about studying it? Back in the 80s, Wortman and Silver produced some very important articles where they looked at basic assumptions of Western societies about grief and grieving. So what they found from the literature was that scientists claimed that people have to confront their personal feelings and reactions to the death. Failure to confront these intense emotions is maladaptive. Thus, the assumption was that to adjust, we need to do grief work. That was a basic assumption at that time in Western societies, at least. And all that I'm saying so far, many of you will be thinking of other cultures, perhaps. Does it apply? Are those bereavement reactions really universal? Those are empirical questions. They're ones that really can be examined. So in any case, in the West, the idea is that you have to do grief work. And I reviewed the literature, as I love to do, and found that indeed it was claimed by many people, both in the grief theories and therapies. I found that this was confirmed. It's the process of emotionally confronting the reality of loss, of going over events that occurred before and at the time of the death, and of focusing on memories and working toward detachment from the deceased. I think these days we wouldn't work towards detachment. I would change that statement now. We know much more about continuing, keeping relationships with deceased people going. So I think that word I wouldn't use anymore, but it certainly was around at that time. And that was the basic notion as to how people could get over their grief without getting into the difficulties that you saw the minority of people go through.